Makeup and cosmetics are a daily feature of the 21st century. You can see the evidence of the $445 billion industry in shops, on advertisements, and most obviously, on the faces of many women that you meet. Whilst there are certainly popular trends and styles within makeup, there is such a wide range of products available for different skin types and tones, and in all sorts of colours, meaning that generally women are free to experiment and express themselves as they see fit via cosmetics. The rise of social media platforms such as YouTube and Instagram have given a very public and accessible view of content related to cosmetics, such as makeup hauls and tutorials, that is both being produced and consumed by women and girls. This freedom and choice available within cosmetics is mirrored by the modern woman's flexible role and opportunities within society. As of 2018, the male to female employment rate in the UK stands at 80 to 71%. Furthermore, over 50% of university students in both the UK and America are female, with a continuing rise of female students in traditionally male subjects such as science, from 39% in 2012 in the UK to 42% by 2017. Learning this, it made me wonder whether the same could be said for women in the past, for women in the early 20th century. Was the way that they chose to utilise cosmetics, if they did so, in any way reflective of their typical roles within society, particularly considering the fact that due to the First World War, these roles that men and women typically played began to change. So that's how I came across my dissertation topic. However, when I came to the researching part, I found that this was an area that's typically neglected by historians. It's really easy to find information on what cosmetics and the styles of cosmetics that women were wearing in the 1900s, the 1910s and the 1920s. But what's not easy, however, is the why. You don't find many resources putting makeup into context historically, into the story of women's lives, socially, politically. It seems it's often dismissed as a frivolous topic. My hope with this research being placed on a public platform is to address that gap and to show that makeup and how it's worn by women in the early 20th century is far more than just a detail, but that it holds a purpose. It can have meaning socially, politically, personally, and that it has significance as a topic of historical study when it comes to women's lives and roles.
In the grand scheme of history, makeup has been extremely overlooked, and I think this is for various reasons. Partly because generally it's a thing that women do and men are often suspicious of. Who's predominantly written in the history of the past? Men have written the history, and to some extent it controlled the history. So we know a lot about war, we know a lot about politics, but we don't know much about what we had in our handbags.
Women's history can sometimes be downgraded or seem as frivolous, as not relevant. But I think it'd be wrong to say that image doesn't matter.
I think it's important that cosmetics should be considered and explored as part of women's fashion history, what they wore, and their personal history, what they felt they should be. They tell a very intimate story about what we wanted to be at certain periods, what our ideals were, what was expected of us. There is a narrative which makes these objects interesting. You know, makeup does have a story.
If World War I is where opportunities began to change for women, then perhaps the best place to start is with the Victorian and Edwardian ladies of the early 19th century and early 20th century, pre-1914. Let's do some research. In addition to my own research, I had the opportunity to talk to my university lecturers and to meet historian Madeleine Marsh in London, who showed me her private collection of vintage cosmetic items.
What is the stereotype of the Victorian woman? Well, certainly the stereotype of the Victorian middle-class woman would be somebody whose domain was in the household. She would be at home. It would be simply not done for her to go out to work. That's what the husband was supposed to do. But her domain was very much a private one. There's a theory about how society is broken down in the 19th century, which is the theory of separate spheres, and there was a sphere for women, which was the private one, whereas for men, their role was to be outside of the household, representing the household, and being seen in public. It was very much just that, an ideal. It was something which you would want to aspire to if you wanted to be fully accepted.
There's definitely a disconnect between the myth and the reality of womanhood. Certain ideals of womanhood seem to punctuate history. They are exclusionary. They are looking at one demographic of who is considered at that time a reflection of the ideal woman. And so they exclude people in terms of race, ethnicity, class, and marital status to a point. If you were a single woman, you were described as a leech. It was okay to be single for a certain period of time, but you were still expected by the time you were, in your 30s, for example, or late 20s to be married.
Class differences played a huge difference in whether or not the woman would abide by this theory of separate spheres. Generally speaking, the lower down the social scale you were, if you were working class, it is much more likely that the woman of the house would go out working. It was because you could demonstrate that as a woman you didn't need to work. That was one of the signifiers which gave you that status, which kind of put you in a class literally above those people who had to work.
If you're going to have real kind of equality and power in society, then you need to have access to work and to jobs.
There were very few other means of gaining money for women at that time. Became more possible towards the end of the century, particularly as there were more jobs that were becoming available in the office. That said, office work was seen as a male occupation, so there was a lot of resistance by men who would not want women to come in and do work in the office. It's perfectly possible for a woman then to sort of move beyond the idea of the separate sphere, where her sphere was the private one. Women were and could be successful in business. It was just simply that the odds were stacked against them. Legally and morally, they were not supposed to be doing that kind of work.
The restrictive nature of pre-1914 society, pushing women towards the private sector and men towards the public in order to be accepted, can also be seen reflected in the daily clothing that they wore as a direct visual cue of who men and women were expected to be, and for women in particular, of the expectation of them to be mothers and wives.
Victorian women were subjected to all sorts of what we now think of as constrictive fashions. By the end of the 19th century, the dress that they were expected to wear still went right down to the floor, which would have presented all sorts of problems as they walked down the street where horses had just been. The middle-class Victorian woman would be expected to be quite demure. Very little flesh, for instance, would be on show. They'd be expected to have very narrow waists, and they'd wear corsets, which would cause, in some cases, deformity and illness as it squashed the organs.
Some things that really sum up for me the horror and the constraint of being a Victorian lady. And this is one of them. My mystery item, ladies and gentlemen, what do you think it is? Well, what it actually is, if you open that top, there, which is going to take far too long. There we are, and there's some holes. This is a glove powderer, and that shape is devised so you could, you know, poke it down the fingers of your gloves, which were so incredibly tight that ladies, you know, did complain that their hands felt like little claws and they couldn't shake hands properly. And there I came across some lovely letters from Queen Victoria when she was complaining with Melbourne about the misery of tight gloves, and that helped you. But again, it says a lot about how Victorian women lived. It was all about tightness. Tightness in the corset, tightness in the glove, tightness in your little boots, all about being a delicate lady. Women were encouraged to use beauty products in that period. So, big hair, loads of powder, loads of, you know, face cream, looking ladylike. Makeup, however, society would not allow you to wear. If you use cosmetics, you were either an actress, a prostitute, or French. Yeah, all of which amounted to much the same thing. So you were supposed to be unpainted, but have a perfect complexion, because a perfect pale complexion was the mark of the lady. Yeah, any sort of, you know, suntan or woe betide a freckle, that was the working classes. So, yeah, somehow you had to maintain this sort of perfect image without applying obvious makeup. But Edwardian ladies had a whole load of tricks up their bag about how to do this. Yeah, firstly, whilst you couldn't paint your skin, no shame to face creams, and all the big brands from Pears to Pond's to Vaseline, all of those great big brands that we still know today kicked off late 19th century. So that was fine. A little bit of powder was okay, as long as it wasn't perceptible and, you know, wouldn't rub off on the gentleman's shoulder if you were dancing with him. That was all right. But there we are. This is in my collection here. I've got a lot of Victorian products. Here are the powders. And the powders and things you put on your face will often say things like guaranteed perfectly harmless, doesn't contain any poisonous products. We are very used today to going to a high street and everything is all laid out at every price. In the late 19th century, makeup wasn't laid out. You would go to the pharmacy and, you know, things were hidden behind counters like a secret stain and bought out secretly. And cosmetic use was largely for the wealthy. So what did you do? You make your own. Every lady's domestic manual or recipe book had little recipes about, you know, how to boil down cucumbers to make a skin salve, things for doing your lips as well. Even though lipstick absolutely frowned on, there were plenty of ladies who went and, you know, painted their lips with beetroot or rubbed it with geranium petals. But yeah, nature abhors a vacuum, and then you might not be able to paint your lips and whatnot. What you did with your hair, absolutely outrageous. That fashion urge is going to emerge in some form or other. And so if you can't do your face, you'll do your hair.
That was one of the very few opportunities that women had in order to show any kind of individuality, in order to express themselves, and was greatly admired and valued by other women at the time as well.
By the late 19th century, we were the major importers of human hair in the whole world, because we had a huge empire, lots of money, imported lots of human hair, because what we wanted were things like this. Oh, how charming is that? Now that is a little false fringe, and it dates from circa 1900. And if you didn't have curly hair like me, but wanted to look like Princess Alexandra, you popped that on the front of your head. And there was a lot of anxiety about the things you did to your hair, partly because another horrible item in my panoply of Victorian things, it looks like a medieval torture instrument, and actually it was a 19th century torture instrument. So this was to crimp your hair, because curly hair, was de rigueur, and if it didn't curl naturally, you resorted to the curling tongs. And there were many cases of women being appallingly burnt, because obviously these were boiling hot, and you curled it in papers. So hard life being a woman. But plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose with hair extensions today. It's all the same. All that crimping and curling and hair dyeing was also hugely popular. Very, very bad for your hair. And this is one of my absolute favourites. One of the products that both men and women put on their hair was bear's grease. So made from real bears. Very expensive product in the day, and it also resulted in the complete destruction of the ursine population of Russia. I think in the 1900s the world began to change with women's beauty for various reasons. Yeah, thanks to the invention of the typewriter, the sewing machine and the department store, women had jobs and a little bit more money. And so really, for the first time, they could buy products for themselves and begin to express themselves a bit more with what they put on their faces. Selfridges, for example, which opened in 1910, they became the first place to put perfumes, cosmetics on open display in the ground floor. The suffragettes campaigning for the vote. In America, there was a very famous march in, I think it was 1912, and as part of their revolutionary dress, the suffragettes painted their lips bright red. And that was a sign of them looking for independence, because makeup was still, for the ordinary woman, it was not acceptable.
The connection between the increase in jobs available to women by 1914 and the new visibility of makeup in department stores cannot be missed. Women's personal expression and desire to control their own image is clear in the way that they got away with the cosmetics that they could within the restrictions placed on them, both in terms of opportunities and fashion. The suffragettes using makeup as a symbol of women's emancipation and rebellion is incredibly insightful into how women themselves deemed the self-expression through the guise of cosmetics as representative of their role within society. Nevertheless, in order to push women's emancipation and along with it cosmetics into the open, it took a world war.
Oh, they put me in the army.
Women's roles changed during World War I because they had to. Because if men had gone off to the front, women had to drive the ambulances, they were working on farms, they were working in factories, they were driving omnibuses, and their clothing changed as well, because for the first time, if they were working on farms, women got to wear trousers. And it was all a little revolution. Didn't last, obviously, when the men came back. The women lost their jobs and the men took back the work, but it absolutely changed their roles and proved that they didn't just have to be fainting femininity sitting there, embroidering and playing the piano occasionally. It changed the perception of women.
Even as far as the Edwardian period, there were plenty of people, men and women, who would have thought that the idea of women having the vote at all was just plain crazy. Why on earth would women want the vote? It wasn't something that was kind of within their sphere. The intervention of the First World War and other factors meant that by 1918 the time was ripe to be offering the vote for, well, as it turned out, some women over the age of 30.
The demands of demobilisation and the desire for stability and a return to a peaceful pre-war time led to the changes that had been introduced for women during the First World War being revoked, and women were generally expected to give up their jobs and go back into the private sphere. But by this point, it was too late. Pandora's box had been opened, so to speak. Women had proved their worth, but more importantly had proved to themselves that they could operate effectively outside of their traditional roles and sphere. As such, though on the surface little changed immediately following the First World War, its major impact on the next generation was yet to be realised.
There's always big changes after wars. Big changes in people's attitudes, big changes in production, because the technologies and the new products that were developed for wartime use invariably after the war are put to domestic use. So, for example, this is something that really helped to liberate our women, was the cellulose cotton that was developed during World War One for gas masks and bandages. After the war, it was used for Kotex, the first sanitary towels. So, war changes everything.
Once women achieve the vote, you see a great number of changes in women's lives, and you see what is being dubbed the new woman of the 1920s period. Now suddenly the new woman is more strong, feminine, and focused on, enjoying life. For the women who were considered new women, they would consider themselves in a positive light, but some other people in society would use it as a point of criticism. The new woman is really focused on white, middle class, or working class women as well, but particularly sort of middle class women. So it would be restricted by race and ethnicity.
The flappers of the 20s cut their hair, away with those, long Victorian locks and the huge towering Edwardian hairdressers. Short hair. They shortened their skirts. They cast off their corsets. And they took to drinking, smoking, and of course wearing makeup in public. It was a revolution, and it sounds trivial in a way. Oh, wearing makeup. It wasn't trivial. It was incredibly impactful as to how they presented themselves and how they could behave. What it meant for the new generation of women, well, one of the things it meant, if you haven't got, hair going down to your bottom and skirts going down there in a crinoline, you can participate physically in the world so much better. So women began playing sport, they took to the beaches, they danced the black bottom. Physically they were freer. For the upper classes, they drove. They were no longer just vassals to their husbands or to the men in their lives. They had greater freedom and they weren't subjected to the hideous fashion prison. Now, life in the 20s wasn't without its pains as well, because, with all these new bits of your body being revealed, more things to worry about, and oh my God, the horror, little bits of hair. Now, shaving, King Camp Gillette. There's one of the first Gillette razors, which was he developed the disposable razor in the early 20th century. Great, fantastic, those were for men. But after the war, ladies showing their bodies, oh my God, what's that? You're not delicate if you show your underarm hair. So here we are. Gillette launched the Gillette Milady in 1916. And this is a little 20s razor made for women. Look how small it is. It fits into this. Look at the size of that. Absolutely tiny. That goes into there. And look at the size of the blade. So pretty and very, very small, so that you could conceal it from your husband. And he'd think you were naturally smooth and perfect. So that's one of my favourites. And if you couldn't be hairy, yes, certainly couldn't be sweaty. With all this dancing the black bottom and playing tennis and all that liberation thanks to your short flapper skirts and changing attitude, women might perspire. Absolute no-no. In fact, Oda, oh no, one of the best-selling brands of deodorant in the day. And it's a beautiful little bit of Art Deco. Again, terribly discreet. You could have this hidden away in your handbag. Nobody would know. And open it up. Isn't that beautiful for patting under your arms? But also what it represents is the burden that comes with freedom, No gain without a certain level of pain, and being embarrassed about bits of your body made a lot of money for manufacturers. Initially, in the 20s, women were wearing makeup, but manufacturers were still quite coy about advertising it. So the women's magazines of the period are filled with, adverts for, creams and slimming things, because obviously the new fashionable gas sunshade. Very few ads for makeup itself until the late 20s, but once then it kicked off. Absolutely endless. It became a massive, massive industry promoted largely by Hollywood. So say somebody like Clara Bow, the roles that she was playing, she was a typist. She was, you know, a New York babe. She was an ordinary city girl, gum-chewing, flirty. She wasn't a posh woman. She wasn't, you know, Lady Ida Werber. She was a street girl, young flapper of the day who was making her way with her lovely lipstick and her hennaed hair and her great big cold eyes. So I think there weren't social boundaries. For the young girls who did it, it was revolution against your parents, revolution against all those people who'd, yeah, the older generation who'd created the war. It was catching a man, because given that most of the young population, male population, had been slaughtered, you know, you had to, you know, look to your laurels and make yourself look your best. There's one item that sums up the change in attitude to makeup after World War I, and that really captures the new freedom and the glamour of the flapper. It's this. This is a little camera-shaped powder compact. So if you open up this side, there's your powder. If you pull out this bit, so where the film winder and the camera would have been, we've got lovely dark red lipstick. Open out the back, and there are your fags, or gaspers as they were known as in the day. And this is only, yeah, this is a little thing. Okay, it's frivolity. But in some ways it says as much about the new freedoms available to women as the fact that women for the first time got the vote. And what you get, particularly in the 30s, which changes absolutely everything, you get Woolworths, where everything costs sixpence. And it's not hidden away, it's all out on display. So everything's on display, and you can afford a sixpence to make yourself look pretty. And the other huge thing, in my opinion, that made makeup a necessity for a woman was the development of the cheap camera. Because back in the day, in the Victorian times, you might go to the photographer once, you'd sit there for 3 hours whilst you took a picture. It was a big deal and you didn't do it very often. What you get, thanks to Mr. Kodak, the development of the pocket camera that was affordable, and once you could take photographs, people were much more aware of what they looked like. And how does that relate to the current day? You know, when we live in the world of absolutely the selfie, and in a world where, you know, the fashion industry might be suffering now, but makeup is booming and booming because everybody's constantly photographing their own face and watching their own face on their phones. How we see ourselves and how others see us. Technological developments go hand in hand with the advancement of makeup and how we feel we should be. We will now go to lipsticks. Again, these are among my favourite things from the 1920s, because this was pure pleasure. You couldn't have had this before World War I. Suddenly, you could paint your lips. The first metal lipstick tube was patented in 1915. That had little push-up levers. In the early 20s, another American patented the swivel lipstick, and after that, no stopping them. Lipsticks came in every shape and in every size, and the mechanisms are so cunning. So this one, lovely little 30s one, push it up. And there's a little bit of the lipstick. Another joy about collecting makeup is that you really do, you smell, you touch, you see the colours of the past. It makes these women absolutely come to life. Pull it back. There's your lippy, and there's your little mirror. Everything's pretty because it's designed to be on display. You could use these in public. It's no longer a secret thing you have to hide like some terrible crime. You can do this in the party with your cocktails waiting on one side, the band's playing in the corner. You put your lippy on and off you go to dance the black bottom. What you see happening in the 20s and 30s is that putting makeup on becomes socially acceptable and a sign of being respectable. Ladies then wouldn't go out without their lipstick on. There are lovely sort of accounts of the Depression in America in the 30s, saying that, if you could just get that 5 cents together to go to the 5 and dime store and, buy a lipstick, it was a morale booster, it might help you get a job because it looks as though you care for yourself. And putting makeup on was increasingly portrayed as, the woman who did it, she cared for herself, she cared for her husband and her boyfriend enough to make herself look pretty. It became not just an acceptable sign of femininity, but an absolute requirement. Cosmetics absolutely reflect the different roles that women have to play at different times. So, take the 20s for example, all pretty little rouges, if you read the descriptions on 20s packaging, it's all about, we'll make you look delicate, we'll make your lips bright without being glaring. So, they sort of, reflected what women wanted to be in the 20s and 30s. In the 40s, if you could get hold of a lipstick in the 40s, it would be bright red, and it would probably be called Patriot Red or Fighting Red. It's at every period the cosmetics reflect our ideals of beauty at that period, and typically across the decades those ideals of beauty change as to what's needed. So 20s, skinny, flappery, delicate. 40s, during the war, strong, butch, you've got your dungarees on, but you've also put your fantastic lippy on and you've hennaed your hair, and if you can, you've done your nails, because underneath that boiler suit and siren suit, you're a lady still. Makeup tells the story. It tells the story of women, across the 20th century, into the 21st century and beyond.
Although the adoption and acceptance of makeup was not universal, the level of freedom now afforded to women in society, which they were able to express via the makeup they wore, visibly demonstrates the change in attitudes when compared to the decades previous. And as such, the new woman and cosmetics are inherently linked. The fact that makeup and cosmetics are now a passed over detail by many interested in women's history, when they have previously been considered so taboo and shameful, is an indication in itself of just how far women's roles and freedoms had changed in the early 20th century. It is a history that is painted on the faces of the women that lived it.